As you know, I'm sure you all know, the BBC is a public service broadcaster. So that means we're not funded by the state, and the state has nothing to do with our output, has no control whatsoever to do with our output. We're funded by license fee, which is a slightly archaic way of paying BBC, and there is continually conversation about whether there's a better way to pay BBC by the audience. But fundamentally, we're paid for by our audience. Not through a subscription model, it's not through a levy, not through tax, but through the license fee. When the BBC charted every year in a few years' time, here knows whether the TV license fee will begin to this, and another way of funding the BBC to be not dependent on the government. It's planning. We are governed by I can make sure. We are governed by a royal charter. The state is great separation of authority from government. And this is the key mission. The key mission for the BBC is to act in the public interest, which is the key concept for us. So all your needs to speak the original thing, parchment, like content, seek it out, and so to inform, educate, and entertain. Sorry, I do apologize. So I tend to wander around before I talk. Does that work? We form, educate, and entertain the values that were instilled in the BBC 100 years ago when we stepped up, and they are still relevant, and they are still relevant now. But I want to talk about the public interest. Marriage. That way. So for us, the public interest is absolutely key for the way we approach our editorial standards. And our definition of public interest is this: freedom of expression, to provide information that helps people to better understand or make decisions on matters of public importance. Sorry, you need to use it. Sorry. A little bit cool. To prevent people being misled by the statements or actions of individuals or organizations. To expose or detect crime or significant antisocial behavior. So we distinguish between illegal and antisocial behavior. And to expose corruption, injustice, significant incompetence, or negligence. Now, this concept of public interest is what we judge everything against when we look at our editorial standards. And these are our editorial values: protection of vulnerable groups, truth, independence, impartiality, editorial integrity, harm and offence, privacy, fairness, and obviously, as journalist, accuracy. That translates, as far as the BBC's editorial guidelines is concerned, into these. It's a big, thick document. It's available online, and these are the key aspects of it: accuracy, getting it right, impartiality. I'll talk about impartiality in a moment. Harm and offence. It's okay to offend people as long as that offence is justifiable. So when we're showing, for example, war, we see graphic and difficult pictures. That's will offend people, but that offence we think is justifiable because it shows the reality of war. Fairness is a really important part of the way you go about our business. Fairness to contributors and how they consent to take part in our content. There's a hurdle for us is informed consent. So if people understand what they're contributing to and why. And that fairness goes into other aspects about how we give people the opportunity to reply to allegations that we make against them and the processes around all of that. Privacy, people's expectations of privacy vary, whether they're in a private meeting, whether they're in their own home, whether they're walking down the street, and how we respond to that and how we deal with that. We look at crime, we investigate, we do a lot of investigations into crime. We talk to criminals, we sometimes collaborate with criminals but we ask ourselves, why are we doing that? Is it in the public interest to do that? And that is an example of how we test ourselves against doing things that might sometimes seem to be inappropriate. We do, for example, in the interest of in the public interest, buy drugs to prove that illegal activity and crime is going on. We do things that might invade people's privacy if it's in the public interest. We have a real consideration around how we deal with children and young people. Clearly, politics is an important part of how we operate, holding power and politicians to account, and how we report fairly and accurately that. When we report war and terror, the BBC continually gets into trouble or gets a lot of criticism and flack for not describing organizations and individuals as terrorists. We will not do that. We will not call Hamas a terrorist organization, because that we believe is a judgmental term. It implies something that it's not for us to apply. We need to maintain our independence from all external interests, be they political or financial. We are very clear about that. And that also means not just the organization, but the individual as well. So where individual journalists, we need to be careful about where they may have a conflict of interest in reporting a story. They may have a connection to a party or a campaign or an interest. We need to make sure that those individual journalists, through their social media activity as well, remains free of any conflict, so that their impartiality and fairness can be seen to be true and honest. At least. So, the tablets of stone, the BBC's editorial guidelines. They are a detailed and complicated document, but they are a principles-based document. They are based on the principles that I've just walked through. And that's why they're so valuable and so useful, because we don't talk about specific detail about what you can and can't do. We talk about principles, the principles of fairness, the principles of privacy, and whether or not they are balanced in the public interest. They were first drawn up about 40 years ago when we were getting a considerable amount of criticism and flack from all aspects of British society, from politicians, and we had nothing to judge ourselves against, and we had no framework for us to set out our journalism. So we drew up the editorial guidelines based around these principles. And what's interesting is, because they're principles based, they're still relevant today. They were initially drawn up 40 years ago in the analog world of radio and television, but now they are as relevant the online world as they were back in the 1980s, because they're principles based. And again, we're using those principles to examine and to extrapolate how we're going to operate in the contemporary world. Issues around how we deal with artificial intelligence, for example, are based fundamentally on the principles that we have outlined in BBC's editorial guidelines. And they are incredibly valuable. They're publicly available, and when people complain, we get hundreds of thousands of complaints a year, and that I actually think is a good thing, because it shows we're doing our job. We're upsetting people, which I think is a good thing to do, because it means that we are reporting, and our journalism is about difficult things that people don't like to hear about. Yeah. So I want to talk about impartiality first of all, and I'm going to run through a few examples that hopefully will illustrate what I'm talking about. Impartiality for the BBC is about reflecting a range of views. We don't have a view. We don't have a view about any of them, but we reflect a range of views across any particular issue. But it doesn't mean that we don't report the truth. So when it comes to, for example, debate issues around climate change, the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence suggests that climate change is happening, it's man-made, and it's having a real impact on the global climate. So we don't find ourselves, impartiality allows us to focus our attention on the fact that climate change is happening, rather than get into debates about whether or not it is happening. We're not in a situation where we deal with balance, he said, she said. That's not impartiality. So that is often, and can often be, a sterile debate. It also means that we don't support any cause or get behind any particular form of action. So, for example, in the Ukraine conflict, we don't support either side. We don't support the Ukrainian side, we don't support the Russian side. But because the BNC's conditioning around our mission, we have our starting point is upholding liberal democracy. So we support the principles, and we will come at our reporting of the Ukrainian war through supporting the principles of liberal democracy, rather than any other form of governmental oppression, freedom of speech, So while we don't support the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainian stomach in this war, our position is to uphold principles of liberal democracy and freedom of freedom of expression. Now, impartiality is one of the things that gets the BBC into most amount of trouble. And I'm going to hopefully run a few examples to sort of explain all that. By way of example, impartiality is often in the eye of the beholder. Since October the 7th, this is how many complaints we've had about our Middle East coverage. And you'll see that they roughly balance, they roughly reflect each other. 4,700 think we're biased against Israel. 5,200 people think we're biased in favor of Israel. So partiality often is in the eye of the beholder. You know, if we're not reflecting back at you what you think is right, you think we're biased. Our answer to that is we're reporting without fear or favour. We're reporting what we see, and we're reporting fairly and accurately. If you don't agree with that, that's absolutely your prerogative. That doesn't mean we're biased. And increasingly, of course, the social media world means that if you're not reflecting your social media bubble, means that if you're not if what you read doesn't reflect back what you think that what you're reading is biased. That is not always the case, as I think those figures perhaps illustrate. So here's an example. Oh, wrong button again, sorry. Here's an example. I hope. So Shamima Begum is a really controversial character in the UK. She was a London schoolgirl who left London to go and join ISIS several years ago. She re-emerged. She disappeared into the caliphate, the so-called caliphate, and she re-emerged a few years later. And she wanted to come back to Britain. The British government rescinded her citizenship. She's no longer a citizen of the British government of Britain, of the United Kingdom. And is a massively divisive figure. Some people say she knew exactly what she was doing when she went off to join ISIS. Other people say she was a victim of grooming of the whole kind of ISIS propaganda machine. Remembering she was 15 when she left London. So I worked with a very talented journalist called Josh Baker, who developed a long-term relationship with Shamima Begum, and we did a big podcast series with her. And he interviewed her, and despite the criticism of the fact that were we giving her a platform or not, the way that we interviewed her and the way that Josh did his podcast, I think was reflective of how we deal with impartiality. Now, I want to play this, and I'm not quite sure which button to press. So could you play it for me?
I'm curious about how you think people perceive you.
Please.
As a danger, as a risk, as a potential risk to them, to their safety, to their way of living.
Do you understand why society has so much anger towards you?
Yes, I do understand. But I don't think it's actually towards me. I think it's towards ISIS, but when they think of ISIS, they think of me because I've been put on the media so much, you know.
But they only did that because you chose to go to ISIS.
But what was there to obsess over? We went to ISIS, that was it. It was over. They just wanted to continue the story because it was a story. It was the big story.
But you do accept that you did join a terrorist group?
Yes. I did.
Oh.
So that's a really powerful piece of interviewing, I think, where he really gets to the heart of the kind of the core issue and reflects how we deal with impartiality. How long have I got? What do you call it? 3 more minutes. I'll do one more. I just briefly one more time.
I'm curious about how you think people perceive.
So anonymity is a big issue for. Right, Ben. I'm going to call this one. Anonymity is a big issue for us. When and where and how to give anonymity. People often have a legal right to anonymity if they're victims of sexual assault or allegations of sexual assault. But also, the question around anonymity often comes up when we're dealing with criminals. So this is an investigation we did into a scam. It's called pig butchery, which is a romance scam. People would the groups in the Far East would scam vulnerable women into giving them thousands and thousands of pounds. Now we did an investigation into this, and this guy here, who we've anonymized, I'm not going to play this, but this guy here who we anonymized was someone who took part in these scams. He was a scammer. And it was a really challenging decision to decide whether or not we should grant him anonymity in order for him to tell us a story, or whether given that he was actually participating in these scams and benefited from these scams, it was an appropriate thing to do. What we did in the end was he had actually decided he had shown remorse, and he no longer committed these scams, and was looking back at his time and thinking, I should never have done that. What I did was fundamentally wrong. So we challenged him about that the same way that we challenged Shamima Begum, and felt it was because the information we were getting from him about how these scams worked and what they did was sufficiently in the public interest, as long as we challenged and held him to account for what he did, was an appropriate and worthwhile thing to do. There's lots to talk about around deception, public interest, about intrusions of privacy and public interest, but maybe we can pick those up in the discussion afterwards. So I'll leave it there for time being. Thank you very much for listening to me.